So you found yourself at the top. After a long career as a midshipman, passing through the ranks of the lieutenancy, finding yourself master and commander of a small sloop, you have made it. Captain of one of the finest vessels in the world, a Royal Navy frigate. But it's not over yet, far from it. You have your eyes set on the Admiralty, but if you want to make it there, you're going to need to learn fast. Getting to the captain's quarters was only the first step. Now, you need to survive as a captain in His Majesty King George III's Royal Navy. If the task of your frigate was to fight for king, god, and country, then you were both king and god, and your ship was the country. There's no higher power than you on the ship, and every single one of the 650 men on board look to you to lead them to glory, honour, and riches, but especially riches. You also need to maintain discipline, make sure your men are fed well, and keep the delicate ecosystem of the ship in absolute balance, or else things may go terribly wrong. There are uncountable dangers for you to face in your new role, and a French cannonball to the face is the least of your worries. Mutiny, hunger, and disease. They're all problems you're going to have to deal with, and as captain, you toe a fine line. Take to your crew too hard, and they may save your skin in battle, but you might find yourself swinging from the topmast, lynched by an angry crew. If you treat them too well, you may be beloved by all, but when push comes to shove, it may befall you that admiration doesn't stop a well-drilled Spanish or French crew from hammering your ill-disciplined rabble. And so, with that in mind, I provide to you the Stair Talk Guide to Staying Alive, Captain of the Royal Navy Edition. The most important and pressing concern you will face is keeping your crew well provisioned. A well-fed crew is a happy crew, and more importantly, a crew which can hold its own in battle. Sailors ate 3 meals a day. Breakfast, which was a small, uncooked meal of ship's biscuit, usually broken up into a sludge with a small amount of water, and a ration of cheese or butter. Lunch, which took place soon after midday and was the main meal. They would have referred to it as dinner, and it was cooked in massive copper pots over the cook's fire. Having a large open fire lit in a wooden ship is quite obviously a bit of a danger, so it wouldn't be lit for long, part of the reason lunch was the only cooked meal of the day. Salt beef, sometimes even years old, would be boiled to soften it up, and the hardtack sludge would be served again. Salt pork was sometimes given, although it was always in a lesser quantity. Boiling was the only method of cooking present for the average sailor, so you were shit out of luck if you wanted anything with a bit of taste to it. Luckily, sailors had very modest palates and probably would have shunned anything with more flavour than salt and fat. Sailors would be given grog at lunch or ale. Then came dinner or supper. This was a modest meal with no meat and the same diet as breakfast, slop and cheese. Lunch was absolutely sacrosanct, and sailors would be given the better part of an hour or more to eat. A captain who interfered with this respite would be very, very quickly an unpopular one. Ale usually ran out quickly into a ship's voyage, but sailors were given up to half a gallon a day or 4 pints, and sometimes even more. Grog was then brought in after the ale ran out and would be around a pint, 4 parts water, 1 part rum. The common recipe of sugar and lime juice was more work of fiction than anything else, but some captains did indeed use it. Grog would be given twice a day and was watered down to stop sailors hoarding their rum. This was as grog spoiled fast, and this stopped, at least in theory, men getting incredibly drunk. Although, if sailors were good at one thing, it was smuggling. Be careful, because if you get too tough on smugglers, the sailors might get pretty unhappy. Best to let the sailors have their drink every once in a while. After all, a drunk sailor is a happy one. Sailors would be given water, of course, but the water was never of good quality and was attributed to a lot of sailors' sickness. It would be collected from any freshwater source, and yes, even the Thames. Despite its reputation as London's sewer, the water would be placed into barrels and allowed to sit for days or even weeks to allow the sediment to separate and settle to the bottom of the barrel. The water was usually stale and tasted terrible, so lime was sometimes added. The wooden barrels would collect slime, adding to the already horrendous taste. A good captain, which I hope you're trying to be, would take every opportunity to collect fresh, good water for his men. The worst case scenario is you're going to have to ration food and water, especially on a long voyage or if supply lines are disrupted. Now, sailors accept that this is a necessity, but you have to do 3 things to keep them happy, or at least as happy as they can possibly be on empty stomachs. First, don't ration the alcohol. There's already an abundance of it, and the only bottleneck is having enough water to mix with the rum. A smart captain would just add less water, and a particularly stupid one would decide to cut the rum too. But luckily, you aren't stupid. Secondly, have some wit when you and your officers are eating. You don't eat from the ship's cook, you have your servant do your cooking, and it's much better than what the men eat. The men don't really mind this though, after all, they expect it. You're a higher class than them, and you have to act accordingly. The men don't want a gutter boy captain, and yet, seriously, this was actually a thing. Officers who came up from the ranks weren't very well received, since the men believed leaders came from the top, and they had a pretty astute sense of class. But don't take the piss. Remember, the men can see the food being carried to your cabin, and dining like a king while the rest of your ship is on starvation rations is not the best look. If you're keeping animals on board, it's better to kill them. Many officers kept cows for milk, but if the men are starving, you'd be wise to slaughter your cows. Give some fresh beef to the men. Thirdly, the captain is in charge of procurement. When you're relieved of your situation and finally have a chance to resupply, take full opportunity. When coming alongside a port, traders will come alongside your ship and sell three things: alcohol, women, and food. You can't buy your men alcohol, but you can turn a blind eye when they buy it. It's best to keep them happy. You of course can't buy them women, but Bible basher captains would prohibit unmarried women on board. Don't act like that if the men have just gone to het them back for you. After all, there's a sailor's wife in every port. But what you can do is buy them fresh food. Fruit, vegetables, and of course, fresh meat is something you aren't necessarily expected to procure, but it will go a long way towards your popularity. And of course, keeping a healthy, fighting, fit crew. Contrary to popular belief, scurvy wasn't exactly the issue it's usually thought to be. On long voyages, lemon and lime juice would keep it at bay, but for 90% of your assignments, this was totally unnecessary, as fresh produce would do the work for you. Sailors ate over 4,000 calories a day, but most of this was bad quality food. And besides, most sailors ended up needing much more. It's a physically straining job with not that much sleep, so the more you feed them, the better. After all, the only man on the ship in danger of getting fat is you, so... Another important thing is routine. See, on the ship, you are the word of law, like literally. You would write your own rules, which would be posted up at the front of the ship. For those who couldn't read, which was most, they would be read out monthly, and these varied from ship to ship. Try and give some leniency to new recruits or transfers while they get the hang of it. You can very easily stir up some anger. But luckily, these rules give you a lot of leeway to make life as comfortable and efficient as possible for the crew. Traditionally, the watches of the crew, or their working hours, think of them like shifts, were split into 5 4-hour increments, with the men split into 2 alternating watches. These watches would be timed with a sandglass, with the ship's bell ringing every 30 minutes. Officers carried watches, but these watches were usually much more inaccurate than ship's time, as ship's time had no relation to the actual measurement, as it only measured 30 minutes from the last call. These watches would be 8 p.m. to midnight, midnight to 4 a.m., 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., 8 a.m. to 12 a.m., and 12 a.m. to 4 p.m. The astute among you will have recognized two things. One, there is no watch from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., and if there was, then one watch would have to work 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. and then midnight to 4 a.m. Hardly very producive for sleep, since all sailors would be woken at the same time. And so the 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. watch was replaced with 2 so-called dog watches, which were 2-hour watches instead of 4 hours. This maximised the sleep on a 2-watch system and reduced working hours. But smart captains, which at this point I will have to assume you are, devised a new system. A 3-watch system allowed the removal of the dog watch, while at the same time allowing a fuller night's sleep for the crew. Here's a handy comparison graph that took me way too long. The things I do. Now, here we have a problem. Not all of the crew were on the watch system, as some men required a full working day. This was usually the specialists of the ships, the armour, blacksmith, surgeon, cook, etc. On top of this, you aren't Nelson, and as much as you would like to be, you're just a young captain, and you command a frigate, which is a relatively small ship by Navy standards. Nothing close to the size of the grand ships of the line which have the manpower to pull this off, but I'm sure the especially keen among you will figure out a way to pull it off. For those of you that are interested, here's a cool fact. The watch bell would be rung out once in the first 30 minutes, twice on the hour, 3 times 1 hour and 30 minutes in, and so on and so forth, until 8 bells rang the end of the watch. On the dog watch, the 5th bell would signal the first 30 minutes of the second watch. At the Nore mutinies, this was the signal for the mutineers. Since then, no Royal Navy ship has rang a 5th bell on the second dog watch. This meant at 6:30 p.m., instead of 5 bells, only one would ring. So it would go 1 bell, 2 bells, 3 bells, 4 bells, 1 bell, 2 bells, 3 bells, and then 8 bells. A bit confusing, but I've concocted this probably more confusing diagram to help. Next, we have discipline. Discipline needed to be kept on the ship, of course, but don't go too far, or you might end up like Pogo, the captain of HMS Hermione, who was killed by his crew after flogging and disrating a popular midshipman and having a pretty terrible policy of flogging the last one down from the topmast. This led to 3 sailors' deaths when they scrambled to get down as fast as possible. On his previous ship, he had flogged so many men that about half the crew had been flogged at one point or another, and 2 men even died from their wounds. The crew got pissed off enough to kill him, and probably rightfully so. Don't end up like Pigot. Your crew probably won't kill you, but they won't be happy. And a happy crew is a good crew if you haven't got that already. Floggings were a common punishment, and the amount of strokes was counted in dozens. Punishment is necessary, so don't get too hasty and just abolish it, or you may be faced with an incredibly rowdy, incompetent crew. But don't be too harsh, or you'll end up with bloody backs. A good working methodology seemed to be creative punishments. These were praised for being suitable deterrents, while also being a tad more lenient on the physical side of things. More traditional punishments included flogging round the fleet, which meant a man would be transported from ship to ship and flogged on every single one, with only a surgeon to accompany him. This surgeon would declare if the man was fit to continue, and a more humanitarian surgeon might be a good idea to employ as a captain. This, however, could only be given by court martial. Officers couldn't be beaten, only shot or disrated. Men could be beaten, flogged, or hanged, depending on the crime. Midshipmen were in a pretty sorry state, as they were open to every punishment, but only particularly terrible captains would physically punish midshipmen, as it was seen as being below their gentlemanly position in society. More creative punishments focused on fitting the crime and could offer at least some modicum of enjoyment for the crew, instead of forcing them to see one of their friends or peers being brutally whipped. For men who fell asleep on watch, instead of the hanging or flogging that was technically fully within your rights, men could just instead pour a bucket of cold water on the offender. A shocking and humiliating gesture for sure, but much more light-hearted than the alternatives. You could go further still and tie the man to the rigging and throw water over him. Slightly more brutal, but tame nonetheless. By the 4th or 5th offence, it was usually customary to drop the man in a cage over the front of the ship, and he was left to starve to death. But as a last resort, you could just hang the man instead, a comparative kindness. Men were never allowed a firing squad, as that was the reserved privilege of officers. If you do indeed need to hang a man, and let's hope you don't, make his friends do it. Seriously, while it sounds like a brutal addition to the punishment, it isn't, and everyone will understand why. A man would be hoisted up by a rope on the topmast and left to strangulate. Usually, though, if the man's friends were doing the hoisting, they would attempt to yank the rope by giving it some slack and then quickly tightening it. This would hopefully break the man's neck and give him a quick death, instead of a slow and painful one. The men will appreciate this small kindness. Moving on from that admittedly particularly morbid segment, we come finally to reward. Up until now, I've been advising you on how to minimize the suffering of the men under your command, but now I'm going to tell you how to make them rich. See, the Royal Navy had an old tradition, a holdover from the English privateer days. If a ship was captured, the ship and the goods on board would be sold, and the proceeds would be split between the crew. When the Spanish ship Hermione was captured coming back from South America, which, by the way, has no relation to HMS Hermione, which we mentioned earlier, which also confusingly was in Spanish service for a while, but it was under a different name. Yeah, they're different ships. Anyway, when the Hermione was captured, the prize money was immense. The lowest sailor and marine who took part in the capture was given around £500. Might not sound like a lot, but this was more than 30 years worth of pay, and was equivalent to around £125,000 in today's money. And let's not pretend this is a particularly altruistic endeavour either. The captains of the ships who captured the Hermione gained around £65,000 each. That's equivalent to roughly £16 million today, and was equivalent to 3,571 years worth of pay for the average sailor. The figures I just gave are even more mind boggling when we consider that the modern figures given are just estimates of inflation. The actual purchasing power of the pound back then was about 10 times higher. So the average sailor got the equivalent of about £1.2 million in today's money, and the captains got over 150 million. Of course, this was an exceptional event. The likelihood is no capture you partake in is going to be close to this, but even something as meagre as 1/100th of the value, which is incredibly achievable, could net your sailors a couple months' pay worth of money, and you could be in for some pretty life changing cash. Keep it up consistently, take part in some higher value captures, and you and your crew can be rich, fat, and happy. Many captains didn't particularly like chasing prize money though. First of all, gallivanting off to the other side of the world to steal Spanish gold or French goods is hardly very honourable or glorious, and isn't incredibly likely to win you any friends in the Admiralty. But your men, of course, have no such concerns, and it's a delicate balance. A battle may win you glory and admiration, and perhaps, if enough of your seniors die, a place at the Admiralty, but it won't do any such wonders for your men, and that's the focus of this video. So go chase that bag, Captain. Get that money. Now we come to recruitment. Recruitment is vital. If you've lost a lot of men, you might be tempted to institute a hot press. This is a type of press where every single man near the ship, as long as they can walk, is liable to be conscripted into duty, regardless of naval experience. Try not to do this if you can. Volunteers usually do much better than pressed men, and if you do have to go for a press, make it cold. Meaning, of course, recruit only able-bodied seamen into your ranks. You can't have a solely volunteer force. That's just utterly unfeasible. But try and make your presses as cordial as possible. If you can, make sure every pressed man is given the opportunity to volunteer. They're already going to serve, but if you can make it so they get paid more for being on paper volunteers, the better. Lastly, as I'm sure you'll be upset to hear, as I hope you've enjoyed our journey together, is battle. This is where your journey is pretty likely to end, if it's going to end anywhere. I've got you this far, and hopefully your very loving crew have done their best, but it's down to the sticks now, and no amount of admiration or love can save you from a French cannonball or the sabre of a boarding party. But it's my duty to try my absolute best. See if you've noticed, I've been treading a fine line between being a particularly altruistic captain and becoming an out-and-out pirate. If you followed along, you don't just have a rich, drunk, womanizing, happy crew. You also have a crew with a personal admiration and attachment to you. Firm but fair. Although admittedly, we've not been very firm and we've been more than fair. At this point, you have a crew of well-fed and committed men, both to each other because you aren't forcing them to hang each other every 5 minutes, and to you. After all, if you die, they get a new captain, and he might not be nearly as lenient. So really, it's in their best interest to fight, and fight like hell. You've built a community to be proud of, and damn if any of the men under you are going to let it crumble beneath them. And you have one last role to play. Here it is, your day of reckoning. It's no Trafalgar, and it's no Nile, but you've found you and your small band of ships have stumbled across a French flotilla. Now luckily you command a frigate, not a ship of the line. You have some freedom to flex your tactical muscles. This isn't about the macro tactics of the day. I'm not going to bore you drawling on about casualty ratios, weather gauges and cannon elevations. No. How do you make sure your crew is ready, and more importantly, make sure they win? Remember what I said earlier about prize money? Well, sometimes you're going to happen upon gunpowder stores on the ships you capture. Don't sell it, stash it away. Captains were given limited amounts of gunpowder by the Admiralty and had very, very little leeway to do drilling with it. If you stash some Spanish or French gunpowder, or hopefully even some high quality Dutch powder, you can blast away at your heart's content. A drilled crew is a good crew. The mandate of the day for a British crew is weight of fire. The French love to be precise, target the masts, make the ship immobile, but the British love to smash apart enemy ships. If you can drill your crew to go from their daily business to battle ready in a heartbeat, and shoot fast and shoot well, you are absolutely set. Of course, don't do full battle drills too often. It often made soldiers miss their main meal of the day, as the ship's fire had to be extinguished. And remember what I said earlier about a sailor's meals? They hate missing out. Anyway, now you have a well drilled, well motivated crew. What's your job though? Well, it depends. Captains sometimes embarked on raiding parties, but that's incredibly dangerous, and you want to stay alive. So stay with your ship. Don't disappear, however. If you're missing during the battle, you most likely will lose that carefully constructed reputation among your crew. Stand among them, shout with them, maybe even get your sleeves up and do something. If the ship is boarded, you best be sure the only way you're going down is swinging your sabre. I mean, you could surrender and live peacefully in France as a prisoner of war, but then you have to wait years to go home, and you'll probably never see your beloved crew again. So that's it. Whether you go down swinging, catch a stray load of grape shot, get particularly unlucky and take a musket ball to the face, or hopefully, of course, you win the battle. Perhaps your drilling and treatment of your crew was enough. Perhaps not. That, however, is now up to you. I hope you enjoyed this video and subscribe if you did. My Discord's in the description and I really certainly enjoyed making it. And if you have any suggestions for my next How to Survive episode, leave it in the comments. Thank you for watching and I hope to see you on the next one.